Thank you very much. I'm going to keep this simple and intimate, I hope. And I want to first of all commend Steve and all the others who have worked with him to make today a reality. It is uncommon that people are prepared to risk their own in order to be able to break new ground. And in fact, it has been one of the areas in which our government, particularly over the last 50, 60 years, has had to contend with. When there are new economic sectors, governments effectively take the lead, largely because the private sector is usually risk averse until they can be satisfied as to how they can get a return on their capital. It is the reason why the government of Barbados would have built the Hilton Hotel back in the 1960s. It is the reason why the government has had to play a role as state entrepreneur on numerous occasions across numerous sectors. And therefore, to have a young Barbadian be bold enough to come to Sherburne, to put on this conference, and to be able to say to Barbadians, business and individuals, that this is something that has tremendous economic and developmental opportunities for us. And I feel strongly enough about it that I'm prepared to risk my own money to be able to put this on and to begin something that hopefully year after year after year, instead of the Ginger Lily room, that you will be moving into bigger rooms and hopefully be able to reach out to others across the Caribbean to be able to help be innovators. And I start from this perspective because in 1995 we put out a white paper on education reform, and it was simply entitled Each One Matters. But it was a recognition in the underlying work and in the foreword of that document that the technology that was beginning to emerge even as far back as 16 years ago was such that it made size and geography irrelevant. And that in that context, our ability to maximize the educational opportunities for every citizen in this country became the sine qua non of Barbados' future development. And some people, unfortunately, may have grasped it only in terms of technology. But I want you to reflect today that technology, like law, can be a tool for empowerment, or it can be an instrument of oppression. It is simply a tool, and that it does not therefore change the requirement for the moral centering and for the values that are critical for human beings to be able to interact with one another in a way that enhances our experience as human beings, spiritually, community-wise, as well as in a way that will bring honor and sustainability to everything that we do. Now, that is important to start from, because judgments are very often made that the technology in and of itself will present the answers. And that is not true. And that you can therefore rest assured that any effort for us as a country to be able to exploit this movement that makes size and geography irrelevant, 250,000 people stuck out in the Atlantic Ocean. They said the Caribbean Sea on the West Coast, but that is debatable. Stuck out there, 250,000 people. How does this country rise above the fact that it has no natural resources of any great quantity that can finance how we live? And the truth is, we have the perfect opportunity now to be able to use that technology, but marrying it to the essence of who we are as Bajans in terms of our commitment to social justice and the other values that have made us who we are over the centuries. Why I compare it to the law? For the majority of the modern settlement of Barbados, law has actually been an instrument of oppression, not a tool of empowerment. It's only in the last 70 to 80 years that you started to see the light in terms of seeing law as a tool of empowerment. It was only in the 1930s that your Master and Servants Act that effectively extended slavery for another century was abolished, because that law said that if you want to keep your house on this tenantry, you have to supply your labor to that plantation. But by the same token, in 1950, Grant Adams piloted a bill that said that everybody over the age of 21 then and then 18 should have the right to vote. And all of a sudden, the law started being used as a tool of empowerment in 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, coming right up to today. But it was an instrument of oppression. Similarly, technology is purely, as you know better than me, a conduit. And the question is, what is it a conduit for? Now, what makes this move and this global development in where technology has gone different? Those of you who studied British history and European history at school, as was the case with certainly my generation when we had to go, even though they started to introduce West Indian history for us around that time, would have recognized that the rise of the Protestant religion was only really possible because of the establishment of the printing press as a common vehicle in Europe to be able to disseminate ideas. But when you looked at it, you still had a top-down movement, even though you were now democratizing religion, and even though you were spreading the content of religion now to millions of people who hitherto had to accept the dictates of the Vatican, and who hitherto had to accept even sermons in Latin in a language that they did not understand. Why is that revolution so fundamentally different from the one that we have started to experience in the late 20th, early 21st century? Because that remains still a top-down exercise, even though it was possible for more and more people to publish and publish and publish, as happened over the years. What, however, this technology does, and particularly social media, is that it makes everybody effectively an author, a critic, a participant, whatever they want to be, they can be with that instrument in their hand. Now, there is no right that comes without responsibility. And we would have perhaps done better as a nation if we instilled that from the very beginning of independence right through, because people will say, man, I got the right to say so, or I got the right to do this. But the problem comes in that every right is constrained by a responsibility, simply because you would have anarchy. Because if I started to criticize you for what you did in a way that was libelous and defamatory of you, if I started to restrict your movements because I wanted to expand my movements to be able to be in this space and for you not to be there, then effectively I would be creating and contributing to anarchy. So that every right carries a responsibility. And how does that relate to social media and public life? Part of the difficulty that we face is that the power to express and the power to be that is inherent in social media has now to be underpinned by a recognition of the responsibilities that you have still to other people. If not, who would stop the creation of a hate movement? Who would stop the creation of propaganda that effectively marginalizes or discriminates against any one group of people? And that is the reason why I started this conversation with the difference between a tool of empowerment or an instrument of oppression. Because that must be ever, you must be ever cognizant of the power of the weapon that is in your hand if you are effectively to respect it and to extract from it the best and the most that you can. Nobody who holds a gun in their hand will be faithful to the responsibility they have in holding that gun if they do not understand the power of the weapon that they have. And one of the things that concerns me is that there will have to be some level of right sizing It's new. It's still relatively new globally, not just locally. And there has to be some level of right sizing, because everybody now has the power to be with the technology that exists. And where does that right sizing take place in terms of public life? Not as a politician I want to talk about, but in terms of public interest as opposed to public life per se. Where does that right sizing take place? It is the same issue that governments have had to start to contend with over the last 20, 25 years and still have not resolved appropriately because of the virtual nature of the technology which you use. That the ability to extract revenue from taxation becomes that much more difficult because of the cross-border usages that takes place on the internet, in a way that it is easier when a good comes into a seaport. You know that the good has landed, you assess what the duties are payable. In respect of commerce on the internet, the world has been grappling with how best do we treat to taxation and the collection of revenue for the commercial activities that takes place in cyberspace. Similarly, in relation to the law of defamation. Similarly, in relation to laws of censorship. So that all of these are issues that we are still very much in the wave. The wave hasn't broken yet. It hasn't reached the shore yet. And how and what it will look like when it reaches the shore, we don't know. Because governments are effectively, like people, trying to find their way. Now when 15 years ago, people, well, let me go back a little further. I first ran in public life in 1991. And in those days, I had a telephone booth cell phone. And I felt great because not everybody had them. And we were able to communicate. And in 91 and 94 and up to 99, we used walkie-talkies for communication on election day. That's 11 years ago, 12 years ago. When I was 15 years old, there wasn't anything called a video machine that was commonplace in people's houses. That just started to come about. Now you watch movies off of the internet onto your iPhone, onto your iPad. And the only certain thing is that change will take place. But societally and culturally, in particular in Barbados, we are a society that is hesitant about embracing change. I spoke to Eric about, for example, how as a virtual newspaper Barbados Today is doing, and whether they've been able to break in certain markets. And the truth is, they too, as well as they are doing with over 55,000 people a day, I think, reading them, there are still some traditions that will take time to break down, like death notices, and whether that belongs to a certain, is there a certain location where people go and look at it or listen to it, that other media as well have not been able to break into. That tradition will still exist as much as people want to break out and use what is there. And we have therefore to find where the right sizing takes place. It's important because I don't need to repeat what you have seen for the last few weeks in other parts of the world, where the power of not just the internet, because effectively the Egyptian government shut down the internet at one point, and satellites had to take the role to replace where they tried to muscle down everything. But the power of Facebook, Twitter, etc., in empowering people, giving them that sense of being able to be, being able to express, has captured the global imagination in what otherwise would be an unanswered cry for freedom. Now, how, therefore, in our context, do we make the best use of it in the Caribbean? Not just Barbados, but in the Caribbean, because one of the clear things that we know in the post-independence era is that economically it is going to be difficult for us to do it on our own. And that is why we have a CARICOM single market and economy, because you do need mass, you do need numbers, you need numbers, you need numbers, all of you, for your business. The greater the pool, the greater the opportunity for economic returns. And therefore, when we talk, therefore, about what our domestic market ought to be, it's not just the 166 square miles that we all know, but it has to be the region as your domestic market, the hemisphere as your regional market, and the rest of the world as your oyster. So that in that context, how is the public interest served by the social media that exists? We've heard already the powers of marketing. And marketing, whether it is from as banal as a fet and a dub, right back to a product, is effectively undertaken in a digital market once you know who you are targeting. No different from real life. Who is it that I'm targeting? How do I capture their attention? And how do I retain their attention? And that remains key. Now, social media, because people are spending so much more time on these applications, it provides the opportunity for data mining and profiling, so that I can effectively determine the kinds of persons who will want to do X, Y, Z, and make a judgment call that that is the kind of person who I can safely market or advertise my product with. Now, how many of us, and what are the public interest laws in relation to privacy that will allow information to be extracted and to be used safely and legitimately in order to be able to enhance the competitiveness of Barbadian and regional enterprises in terms of expanding their market base? Is it clear that we can access this information in a way that does not offend the privacy of a particular individual? Or have they abdicated that right to privacy by participating in a public social environment, which is effectively what Facebook is? These are the issues that have to be determined, and will not be determined just by us alone, but as I said, by the experiences of sharing best practices across the region and the Commonwealth and the wider world, largely because no country, none, can tell you that they have worked out how best to manage what is effectively now an army of people who have the right to be. Now, democracy is about the people. Its origin as a word, its philosophy as defined, but its reality has always still been a top-down exercise. And for the first time now, the opportunity to use this technology allows people to own their environments, but they have first to be sensitized, and they have secondly to want to do it. And that is why I keep saying that the technology is merely a tool. So how much ever we know that it is there, and how much ever it is used only for social chit-chat, communication, etc., that's great. That's what it was intended for initially. But its wider usages, as reflected by Tunisia and Egypt, as reflected by those who are now enterprises who have a continuous and constant Facebook presence, is much, much greater. And how do we, in politics, equally seek to use it to disseminate information so that there's a greater level of engagement of average citizens, rather than simply believing that that reporting must come once every 5 years when there's an election? How many of you, for example, want to be able to speak out about the quality of the telecommunications infrastructure in this country? How many of you, I see you, how many of you want to be able to say that for a country that has the kind of development profile that Barbados has, that there is no functioning 3G or higher network in Barbados is a crying shame, and that it does not, it is like keeping us back in the 80s and 90s in relation to the one thing that we should be competitive and ahead about. I was reflecting earlier to a colleague, I think it was Corey, who came up to me speaking about the Barbados Entrepreneurship Foundation, about Wi-Fi in Barbados. We had a telecommunications subcommittee just as for the last year before we left government. And one of the things, apart from the technical issues such as local loop unbundling, which is simply to ensure that every company doesn't have to put down its own infrastructure, because that is like every major parish or every major car company wanting its own highway. You pool your investment in infrastructure, and then you work out your access rates and charges for everybody to be able to deliver what they want to deliver. If not, it is a wasted investment in the country. And the country ultimately will ensure that the consumers are the ones, obviously, who will have to repay for the investment which has been made. So local loop unbundling makes sense. The VOIP has literally stranded the investments of major telecom companies across the world, not just here, because the whole technology effectively renders a lot of that sunk investment useless. And in that context, we looked at the one key issue of how do we create the next level of development in Barbados. If in the 19th to the 20th century we had 200 primary schools across 166 square miles, that is more than one primary school per square mile. And we understood that even the delivery of a 7th standard education gave us that platform to be more competitive over other countries with similar assets and populations, etc. And that because of that, we were committed, and still are, to the notion that free education must be the promise that will deliver liberty and social and economic empowerment to our people. Well, if you understood that in the 19th to 20th and mid-20th century, then surely you must understand now that information and access to information will continue to be the liberating factor, because it is not only access to information, but it is access to the world. And if your message and your content is good enough to capture the imagination of a global community, then you are capable of doing that which could never be done easily before by members of our population. Now, how do we make that happen? Now, if we were to say in the 1940s and 50s, you think we got a cricketer boat here that could become the best cricketer in the world? And people would look at it and say, man, you're crazy. You're crazy. But I don't know where the next software genius is in the globe. I don't know if it's in Britain's Hill. I don't know if it's in Gemswick. I don't know if it is in Rock Hall. But what I do know is that we would never know if it's from Barbados if we don't give people the opportunity to be able to find themselves and express themselves. Genius doesn't come by coming here at Sherburne or by going into Parliament or going into Bridgetown to a store or whatever. Genius comes by that person having access to practice their art almost obsessively, 18 out of 24 hours a day. So what does that mean? That you have to give people access when it is readily available to them. And effectively, therefore, to Wi-Fi Barbados, and to make up to 256K or 512K free at point of delivery is absolutely critical for us being able to find the true vision of where we as a people can go. Now, we started the work before we left government. Not much has been heard about it. I've spoken about it in Parliament once or twice since then. And I will continue to speak to it, because even though it is free to you at the point of delivery, we recognize that a redefinition of what constitutes universal access in telecommunications can no longer be basic telephony. In other words, everybody having a fixed line, but has now to be the right to basic free internet service up to a certain level. It means that anybody who wants serious multimedia capacity still will pay. It also equally means that we have to find a way to fund that and the telecoms providers, and it is probably better that we zone the country into 3, 4, or 5 zones and have the telecoms providers bid for the zones. They will not necessarily be providing it free, because they will have to be paid for their investment. But we find a mechanism that is reflective of how we have treated to education in this country to ensure that those families and those geniuses who we don't know where they are, but we know that they deserve an opportunity to be the best that they can be. We know that. And that whether it is a $2 a month on a cell phone or whatever it is, that we pool the resources of the country, given the penetration levels in mobile telecommunications, in order to make that available, because God knows that there's a genius among us waiting to emerge. And this is what this country is about, giving people that opportunity. And this is what social media is about, giving people that opportunity to be. And for once, therefore, in our history, we have the potential for a coincidence of interest. How we play the game and what we do to exploit it will determine how successful we are ultimately. I say to you that there is no doubt in my mind that we have to be able to expose and exploit more of the social media across every facet of our life. But I caution that it must be done in a way that is respectful of what society sets out to do in the first place, to sustain and reproduce itself. And in order to sustain and reproduce yourselves, then each individual who has a right to be has to temper it to the extent that they have a responsibility to their brothers and sisters who share that same space. Whether it is Twitter, whether it is Facebook, whatever it is, that anchoring of rights by the recognition of responsibilities, that appreciation that this wonderful tool can not only be a tool of empowerment and enrichment and liberation, but equally can be an instrument of oppression and tyranny. If we understand that and are cognizant and sensitive to these things at all points, then I believe we can be far more effective and successful and laser-like in how we, as a population of 280,000, can make use of these resources to make Barbados truly a place that is recognized globally as one that contributes to the human condition by making things better and adding to the quality of life that all humans have, not just those living on this rock. This gives us our opportunity to continue to punch above our weight. And whether we recognize it or not, that has been the legacy that has been left for us by those who have gone before. We can choose to lime, which is good, and I'm one of the biggest limers out when I'm ready, and play the fool on Facebook, or we can choose to do that as well as to use Facebook and Twitter for other meaningful activities that effectively expands our opportunities for success. I trust that it will be the latter. In relation to politics, as I said, politicians sometimes are the ones who like to defend the status quo the most. And unfortunately, the status quo is not going to enhance our democracy. The status quo is not going to carry us to the next level. And the status quo is not going to allow us to be able to meet our obligations fiscally and otherwise. And therefore, the question is, how do we improve our democracy by a more continuous engagement of our people? I spoke to you about the telecoms example as a movement, but I could equally have said, what about the environment? What about the gullies? What about the fact that in 30, 40 years, if there's an increase in temperature, rise of 1.5 degrees, that beaches and coastlines that you know now in your lifetime will not be there? Politicians respond to numbers. You get elected via numbers. They hear you when numbers start to add up. And even though The old people tell you one blow is kill old cow. The truth is, if you have one blow times 100,000, you can imagine how more effective you will be. That's what the social media does as a tool for you. Give you the ability to feed the information to people, to allow people to make up their minds. What is my position on this issue? What should we be doing? Why is it that we're not taking X action as opposed to Y action? Why aren't the telecommunications companies in Barbados being more responsive to a population that has one of the highest penetration levels in the Western Hemisphere? In fact, is among the top 3 in the Western Hemisphere in terms of internet and cellular penetration. Why isn't it necessary for Barbadians to recycle and separate garbage? Why are we still dumping in gullies? What is the impact given the fact of where our water supply comes from? Those are the kinds of questions. And young people, predominantly under 40, are less interested in B or D or G or F or C. They're not into the alphabet other than to spell words. But they're interested in causes. And those who believe that young people are not interested in politics because they're not interested in parties, better think again. And it's not just Barbados, but it's across the globe. You capture young people's interest through the particular causes with which there is a simpatico, with which they are empathetic. And Facebook and Twitter give you the opportunity to be able to access people who feel passionate about a cause without you having to know them personally. Other than that, geographically, before that technology, you go, you meet, you put an ad, maybe people come out, maybe they don't, you host a house, maybe people respond, maybe they don't. You still do those things because that human interaction is critical. But all of a sudden now, you have the opportunity equally to reach people who you don't know and would not necessarily be able to reach in any other way. And how do we use that as an instrument for good in the building of this country and in the building of your particular careers and your particular businesses? And that is the challenge, how we right-size it, how we get the balance correct between the public interest, the level of regulation and legislation necessary to protect. Is it sufficient under the Constitution and the various acts that we have? Do we need to tweak it? How do we protect the privacy issues while at the same time recognizing, as I'm not sure who said it earlier, that this is a great platform for greater transparency and accountability? How do we get those issues right? And much of the next decade is going to be about testing and fixing, because we are going, in the words of Star Trek, where no man has gone before. And therefore, to assume that we will get it right and know it all up front is to have a level of arrogance that is usually struck down in the classics by the gods. So we are in uncharted territory, but we are certainly in territory that is not to intimidate us. And if we start the process and we recognize that we will learn from our experiences, but we remain anchored to the precept that this is just a tool, and who I am and what I stand for is perhaps even more important than it ever was, because I have a weapon in my hand that is lethal.